Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, Paul Hoppy joins me for a discussion of tropes in TV and movies. We're talking about the role that they play and how they can be subverted. We're asking, can chess be a superpower? And we're talking about what is the nature of redemption and forgiveness and conquering one's demons. All this in a discussion of the new Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit. Right after this commercial break, we have no control over. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host. And as I mentioned, today we're talking about a show that is a little bit outside the realm of what we normally get into, The Queen's Gambit. But there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Paul suggested it, and he seems to have charm speak when it comes to me in that regard. But more importantly, Paul and I had for a while been wanting to talk about the nature of tropes in media, and especially in the kind of genre media that this show focuses on. And this show, Queen's Gambit, actually does some really interesting things in terms of the way it explores and subverts some tropes. And especially, and as Paul's going to discuss later, while it is not a traditional superhero story, it is about basically a chess prodigy, a young woman who from a very early age is incredibly gifted in chess and spends most of the episode as kind of like the origin story of a chess superhero. So it is a bit of a stretch, but I think it's, we don't have a ton of new content right now, and so we're widening the doors. But I do think that there's a lot of great discussions here, and frankly, as people who are into the kind of things we're into, probably a lot of us have some time in a chess club, some time in our background, or have been opening up a chess app at some point in time. But even if you have no interest in the game of chess, I think the show is quite enjoyable, and I think you're going to get a lot out of our discussion today. So, Paul, welcome. How are you doing today, and what made the show one you wanted to dive into?
I'm doing well, thanks. I think what made this show one that I wanted to dive into was I watched it in about 7 hours from when it was released, and that's about how long the show is. So I was just like, oh, maybe I'll look at this show, and then I just kind of got stuck in it and kind of like transfixed and just watched the whole thing right away. I mean, and what made me think about this podcast as I was watching the show, one was I think Matthew might like this, and we like to talk about things that we watch, and we'll do that on the show. But another one is like Beth Harmon is a superhero, and she has a tragic backstory. She develops a power most other mere mortals cannot achieve. She goes through struggles where she's not sure she wants to continue using her power. Then she finally overcomes her demons, and with some help from her friends, defeats her ultimate foe. And, maybe she's not directly trying to, like, help people the way most superheroes are. I would argue that she does, create a positive benefit in the world, just like with her existence and being herself. But, like, that whole paragraph basically is just, it's, to some extent, it's like a list of tropes. Of superhero story, origin story kind of tropes. But at the same time, I felt like the show did a really good job of not just following exactly, the way, like the kind of formula, the very basic formula, even though when you just like phrase it that way, it kind of comes out that way.
For sure. I mean, I think one of the things I found most striking about the show was the number of times it set me up in what I thought would be what the trope would do, and then didn't pay it off in quite the same way.
Right.
And also that it and we'll get more into this in a second, but also I think also really highlighted for me how much the tropes that we think of as so dominant today are in many ways only 10 or 20 years old, because in some ways this is from a book that was written in the 80s, and it's very it fills a lot of the tropes of that period. But not a lot of the more modern ones. But before we get into that, I want to give a quick summary of what happens in the story and say we will be spoiling the show. I think it's a very good show.
I think I just did.
Well, yeah. And I think to some extent I feel like it's a show where, again, tropishness, like there's not any huge plot twists that I think come completely out of left field. And I think most of the plot marks are fairly predictable, and what makes the show so good is the way that it gets there, and the characters and the way it's all played out. But that being said, I think so. If you're not ever planning to watch the show, or that you are planning to watch the show, but you can kind of guess what it's going to be about already, please listen in. If you do think you're going to watch the show at some point, you don't want to get spoiled, please press pause, because we will be spoiling it all. But I'd strongly recommend watching it, and then this will still be waiting for you. Come on back in
7 hours.
Or if you're perhaps a little bit more normal about these things,
a week,
tomorrow,
a day. Okay.
Or like a couple weeks or whatever.
Sure.
The internet is forever. We'll be here for you whenever. But so, quick summary of the plot, and of course it will not be quick, but I'll do my best. Beth Harmon is a young girl in Kentucky in the 1950s. Her mother is living in a trailer, and obviously there's a not doing very well mentally, and having real conflict with her father. And then
with Beth's father,
with Beth's father, yeah. And then the mother and daughter are riding in a car, and there's a terrible car accident. And the mother dies, and Beth is unharmed. Beth is then taken to an orphanage where, and here was where I think kind of the first trope was really subverted. It's an orphanage that is a 1950s orphanage, and it's not great by any means. And they give the kids tranquilizers to help keep them calm. But I kept expecting to see all of the terrible things, for the girls to just be heartless, evil bullies, or the teachers to be, impossibly cruel and mean. Or while at the orphanage, she winds up befriending an older man who's clearly... he's a janitor, he's socially awkward, but he's good at chess, and he teaches her chess. And just, the way shows are today, I kept waiting for him to be inappropriate in some way for her. That never happened. It's an orphanage, it's a shitty situation, but it is what it is. She gets adopted into a family. Again, some problems here occur. The husband winds up very, very clear that he didn't really want the child. The mother is, not great by any means. And kind of has her own problems with drugs and alcohol primarily. But along the way, Beth has gotten very, very good at chess and now starts to, really dive into the chess world at a very young age. And at the age of, I think, 9 or 10, she, with the help of that janitor from before, wins the state championship.
No, so when she's 9 or 10, she does the simultaneous exhibition.
That's correct.
Beats a bunch of kids at like the high school or something, and then I think she's 15 when she goes to the first like real competition.
Okay, yeah, she's still quite young, and she beats quite a lot of adults, but also beats some people who are just a couple years older than her. And then most of the story is about her making her way through the chess world while wrestling with her demons of, a lot of it's alcoholism and drug abuse, tranquilizers specifically. But also the show does a really incredible job of showing the effects of childhood trauma on a young person. And she's never diagnosed, but she certainly exhibits a lot of symptoms that I think today would be understood as, somewhere in the realm of PTSD or borderline or things like that. She has great trouble connecting with people in a lot of ways, and that affects her relationships in a lot of ways, especially romantically with people. And so the course of the show, and the other thing about her is that she is so I was going to say fanatically, and I think in some ways that's accurate, dedicated to chess that there's really nothing else in her life. And her biggest struggles are often when she will get to incredible heights of chess, but, become second best in the state or the nation or something like that. And it is really crushing to her. And so as the course of the story goes on, she starts to develop relationships with people. Those relationships don't go well, in part because she has such trouble connecting with people. And in one case, someone has trouble connecting with her. Her alcoholism and her tranquilizer use get worse and worse. The mother dies. Things go even further downhill. There's all sorts of assorted family drama, and until she really kind of gets to a very bad place where she's, drinking all the time, thinking of quitting chess. And a couple of the men in her life try to connect with her and try to kind of reach out to her and save her, and they're not really able to reach her. And it's when her childhood friend Jolene, a black girl who she was at the orphanage with, kind of comes back into her life to really kind of help her get things turned around. Again here, somewhat subverting a trope, because Jolene, I think, does somewhat fall into the Magic Negro kind of trope, but also really doesn't in some important ways, and is a lot more self-actualized in ways I really appreciated. But the point being, she helps her get herself cleaned up. She eventually gets back into the chess world, and in a, wonderfully 1980s kind of inspirational kind of scene, all the guys who have been kind of her both either lovers or friends and often opponents in chess, many of whom she did not part on good terms with, all kind of rally around her and support her, and she's able to defeat the Russian who's been her nemesis, and, celebration scene. So I skipped over a lot of important details, and we'll get more into the depth of her story as we go on. But Paul, is that, you think, a fairly accurate recitation of like the main arc of the story here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a solid, like, 1-page kind of summation of basically, what happens.
Yeah. So I wanted to dive more into tropes, but let's just take another moment or two to talk about the show itself and what we liked so much about it. I think for me, as I mentioned, I really did love the how relatable her dealing with trauma is. I've talked before about some of my own mental struggles. I found her character incredibly relatable, especially in the some of the problems she has and the way sometimes she cuts people out of her life. Definitely things that I did at a point in my life that I'm certainly not proud to look back on. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was they show her as that there's a real kind of almost connection between her tragic backstory and her as you called it, her superpower with chess. That she is, in part because she's so withdrawn in the world, able to really kind of go very deep into her own head and just kind of play chess in her mind. These beautiful scenes where she's playing it on the ceiling in her mind. What was your kind of take on how they connected those dots and showed her development?
So I think, I really loved how the story tied those two elements together, but also kind of oscillated between them. You had the, everything else in her life and then chess, right? But I think her sort of, you said fanatical, I'd say basically obsession with the game. Yeah. Which, doesn't have to be a negative thing, right?
I think it's a better word.
I think the way that anyone gets truly amazing at a thing is to spend just countless hours, not just doing the thing, not just learning and actively engaging with it, but also just, you can see that she's like subconsciously, it's always in her head. And, I'm not an amazing chess player by any stretch, but I have had periods when I looked at a whole lot of chess content, played a whole lot of games, and like when I go to sleep, I see pieces or like have dreams of them. And given that that's her life constantly, basically from when she's 9 until, I don't know, 18 or 20 or wherever she is at the end of the series, right. I think, that's just got to be kind of constantly, it's like it's a part of her that she takes with her, because she doesn't need a chessboard there to play a game of chess, right? She can play through a game in her mind. That's like the way you play chess, is by being able to envision what the pieces are going to do. And right. I think there's something about, she has this trauma, and she has pretty much constantly a very difficult life situation, but never, like, after the trauma, it's never like, what's a good way to put it? It feels like it's not like constantly infringing on her ability to think, right? Like, she's not being physically tortured. She's not being physically abused. Things aren't great. She doesn't have a lot of friends. She's got her one really good friend at the orphanage, Jolene. And then, she's got her adoptive mother later, who at first they're very distant, but then they're very, kind of together, but still distant because... Yeah. Beth spends so much time thinking through all these variations, thinking chess games in her head, that, if she's sitting there thinking that, like, she's probably not talking to someone very much, right?
There's an old saying that I've often heard, often in regard to, like, drugs or alcohol, but I think can be applied to almost anything, which is, the question to be asked is, what does it do for you versus what does it do to you? Mm-hmm. And this is kind of what you're saying. Like, I think you're right. Being obsessed with any particular thing is by no means a bad thing. I think the questions become, what's the source of the obsession and what is it doing to you? And I think my take on it, at least with Beth, is that, at least at first, chess is very much an escape.
Oh,
it's a way to be not thinking about the death of her mother and all the terrible things that happened. We do, by the way, find out later, although maybe some people who are smarter than me figured it out earlier, that her mother's death is a suicide.
Yeah.
And possibly an attempt to kill the daughter as well.
Seemed 100% likely to me. She's like, what am I going to do with you?
Yeah, she's in a situation where she can no longer support the daughter, in part because of the father being estranged and all sorts of things about that. But yeah, I think it's very much an escape, and then continues to be as a, like, in a way that I think I've definitely seen happen before. Of, you know, as you were kind of saying, like, because she's so focused on chess, she's not really doing much socializing. And now it becomes kind of a spiral or a cycle, because it's now, I never learned how to socialize because I was so busy focusing on chess and because of all this trauma that happened to me. So now attempting to learn how to socialize means going into these social situations that are very uncomfortable. That seems like a terrible idea. I'll just still keep focusing on chess.
Right. And she does go into some of those situations and is basically welcomed into them. And then she's sort of like, what's this? This is stupid.
Yeah.
And then, you know, swipes a bottle of liquor and leaves.
Yeah. Like there's one scene where she's invited to be, like, at first, like, you know, her high school is very kind of tropey, not tropey, but very kind of cliquish. And at first, like, she's not really welcome with the cliques until she becomes kind of a celebrity, because she's, you know, this young, you know, chess prodigy who's getting written about in the news all the time. And so the cool kids kind of invite her to their party, but they're all doing these things that she has no real connection to. You know, they're gossiping about boys, they're like enjoying TV and music and movies that she has no connection to. And so, yeah, I feel like it's she's kind of dips her toe and is like, eh. And one of the things I think is really interesting is most of the people who she then meets later in the movie are people for whom this question of what role does chess play in my life and what role do I want it to play and is that healthy is a major part of the discussion, you know. And yeah, you know, one of those characters, Beltic, is someone who she defeats early on, and he's kind of like an arrogant ass, and he really kind of calms down, and we find out later he's had this massive crush on her for many years, and, you know, she winds up going to bed with him, and they have kind of a nice connection for a little while, although she once again has no real ability to connect on a kind of like intimate level beyond bodies. But, you know, we find out he really is kind of over chess, and he kind of gets to a point where he thinks chess is doing more harm to him than good. And she's still not in that place. That's part of why they drift apart. And so, yeah, I think that was another thing I thought really interesting was the way it really explored. It doesn't say like her chess is bad and she should stop having chess, but it kind of says that what she needs to do is to be at a place where chess can be a major but not the only part of her life, and that can be one that she has kind of control over instead of it being like, you know, it can be a thing that she loves and enjoys rather than a like, I hate myself if I'm not good at chess kind of thing.
Right. I mean, well, so I'd say I'm not sure I 100% agree in terms of like, I feel like she doesn't necessarily need a bunch of other things in her life. Like maybe that's just the main thing that she just, that's what she's interested in, you know? Right. I think that's fine. I don't think that there's any real like need for other interests. I mean, she has some small
I mean human connection and like,
right.
I guess to me it's two things. One is the human connection, but the other part is, and an early part in the movie, and again, this is one that I could really relate to, when she loses, or even when she thinks she's losing, it is obviously this huge blow to her self-image and her ego. And she goes into a bathroom at one point and is, you know, kind of yelling at herself as like, you ugly piece of trash.
Right.
Because she might not be able to become the state champion.
Right. So the part that I 100% agree with is that she needs to find a way to not have all of her self-esteem come from basically being an invincible chess player.
Right.
Like she can have some of, or most of her self-esteem even come from being great at the game, or even just have her identity wrapped up in like, this is what I do, this is what I care about, you know, I am great at this. But like, you know, at some point you lose games, right? Yeah. Like the best in the world lose games a lot. And I mean, sure, Magnus Carlsen had like a 2-year plus undefeated streak recently, and Ding Liren had one of like over 100 games, and Bobby Fischer had a long ass one too. But like the point being is like, you're gonna lose some games because
Right.
other people are trying also, right? And and there's also eventually there's going to be someone younger and quicker and whatever. And the point being that like there's some ground between like I can't invest myself too fully in this pursuit compared to like I'm getting all of my self-esteem just from winning, specifically from
Right.
winning, right? Like you can take, I've seen players talk about the greatest games of their life or one of the greatest games they ever played, and it was a loss,
Right.
and they're like super proud of their loss because they played in like an immortal game, and it takes two players to create an immortal game, right?
Yeah.
It's like one player has to, like, if I'm not giving you brilliant moves to play against, you can't really come up with something that's really brilliant. You're just like, oh, I just win because you're not that good, right?
Right.
Because you made a
The
mistake.
brilliance is in overcoming a challenge, and
Exactly.
if you're both challenging each other in amazing ways, yeah. Like no one gets famous, and this it's interesting. We talked about her as a superhero. In many ways, I feel like the trope that she really this show really embodies is the sports hero idea.
Yeah.
And that any great like any great boxing match, any great baseball game, football game, whatever it is, chess is a mental competition, and which many people would look at as a sport in that regard.
Yeah.
But it certainly fits that story element of, and I think one of the things they're very intentional about this in that the last scene of the whole series is her, she's getting talked to about how now she's this American hero because she defeated the commies and all this kind of stuff, and she just gets out of the car and walks a bit through the streets of Moscow. And walks to a place where people are just old men are playing chess in the park, and she sits down and with such a huge smile on her face, like they all welcome her and are like, "Come play, we know who you are, you're amazing." And she just has so much joy on her face as she starts the game, and to me, a lot of that was about her rediscovering the fun of this. Is that kind of your take on it as well?
Yeah, for sure. It's like she's there to. I mean, like she's probably gonna win, right? Like she just defeated the world champion, like. She'll probably win, but like it feels like she's not there because she like needs to win. It's like it feels like at that point she's like, I love this game, and I see this park filled with these old men who all love this game. Like they're here, it's probably cold outside, and she's like, I'm gonna sit here and play because we all love this game. And that's like, that transcends the whole like beating the world champion. That transcends like the journey of just getting good or whatever. It's like kind of the like for love of the game kind of moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought it was just a perfect ending.
Yeah, especially because
I found surprising too, actually.
Yeah, I mean it was. I mean. It's a happy ending, like
right,
that alone,
right, exactly.
It's funny because, and we'll start to shift into trope talk now, but like it very much is. It reminded me that the trope used to be the person has some demons, they never get that bad, they hurt people along the way, but the people come back and still love them and still help them and support them, and with their support, they overcome the bad guy and win.
Right.
And like, yeah, that's very much a trope, but it felt super surprising to me because now. Like, if this movie were made now, we're going to talk a bit later about the redemption stuff, it would have been much more grim dark. It would have been like she loses everything and all the people she ever loved turn on her. And just at the moment where she's maybe going to be getting her life back together, one of the people she hurt comes back and like hurts her, and that makes everything fall apart. It would have been just like a much more harrowing story. And it's funny because, 20 years ago, I was super sick of the hero always wins kind of trope. Today, I found this incredibly refreshing because I was like, oh, yeah, sometimes people can just do a good thing and it's okay. And it's to me, it was interesting just how much that is a change in the kind of stories we normally get these days.
Yeah, I mean, this was written in 1984. When
the book, not the series, but yeah,
right.
It's based on a book written in 1984.
Right. To clarify, it's based on a book written by Walter Tevis, who also wrote the book that The Hustler and The Color of Money were based on, and actually 1983 I think was the publication date, but. So it was going to be adapted for like a long time. And I think Heath Ledger was actually going to do it at some point. I don't think he was going to play the title character, the main character, but I think he was going to be attached in some way. But it, ultimately it became a Netflix series, and I don't know how exactly it tracks to the book. I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's some differences, but it does seem like in the 80s, like people were mostly, if you wrote something about U.S. sports people, they were probably going to beat the Soviets, right? Like, and now it seems like we're in an era when everything it's like you're not really getting a lot of happy endings, and I'd say a lot of the tropes now are kind of counter tropes to like prior tropes, right? And personally, I like happy stories. I like seeing stories where someone goes through a lot and then ends up okay. I don't want every story to be like that, but I also don't want every story to be just like, depressing. And I mean, it's a heavy show, and I mean, you're calling it a movie some. It's basically like a 7-hour movie, right? It's a limited series. This isn't season 1. This is the season. This is it. It's 7 episodes.
Which I also love so
me
much.
Me too. It's like at the end, it's like, okay, we're done. I really enjoyed it. I get it to end like that. There's no cliffhanger. There's no, but what happens next? Like, I can think, but what happens next? I get to decide, You get to decide. Like, does she go and talk to all her exes? Like, do they still harbor some resentments, but they're like, they got over it just for the minute? Like, we don't know. We can think through that ourselves, right? But, like, there's an end point. I'm tired of there not being endpoints sometimes.
Yeah. And so now we're talking more about the trope aspect. Let's back up into like the discussion of tropes themselves. Mm-hmm. And let's just start easy. Like, when we say that word, like, I think a lot of people have a vague understanding of it, but it's hard to narrow down. What is a trope in your mind?
Yeah, so they're basically plot conventions, plot devices, like narrative tools, kind of like patterns that a show, a movie, a novel, whatever, will frequently fall into, and they can be things like, a mentor dying before the hero reaches their potential, or like villains killing off their henchmen to show like how badass they are. Those are like two of my least favorite tropes. They can also be simple things like swashbuckler in a long coat, which, is one of my favorite tropes, even though it's like whatever. Or like, vanquished foes becoming lifelong allies. And all 4 of those tropes, aside from the villain killing the henchman, show up here, right? But, I mean, it's basically just like a thing that you expect might happen because you've seen it happen in a bunch of other media. Right.
Like, any time where the pieces start getting moved and you can pretty easily predict what's going to happen. Like, if you've ever been in that sort of thing of like, all of a sudden we're emphasizing the emotional weight of this particular side character, and you're like, okay, that person's about to die.
Right, exactly.
That's a trope,
Yeah.
And it can be a very particular, like, just a specific scene kind of a thing. And it can also be like a larger, idea in media. Like, I've talked before about the concept of fridging.
Right.
That's very much a trope, the idea that a woman character exists to primarily have her death be a motivation for a male character, or the magic Negro term that I used before of the person of color who exists mostly to be a source of great wisdom and a little bit sort of like, offbeat knowledge for our main character. That's a trope.
Right.
The happy ending, in when it's like you're always going to have a happy ending somehow, that's a trope. In the same way that now the grim dark of like, something will, there's so many series right now where, you'll face a challenge the entire series, and in the last episode you overcome the challenge, but just when it seems like our heroes can sit back and, have their shawarma and enjoy whatever it is, the next terrible thing comes. Like, the Flash and the Arrow did this all the time. That can be a trope. So what's wrong with tropes? Why is this something we're talking about as like not always a great part of media that we love?
Yeah, so I mean, there's nothing like inherently wrong with any particular. Well, I'll take that back. There's certain devices that can be awful because they're like racist or sexist or whatever. But
when they're playing on stereotypes and it's sort of like the
and
the woman is a shrew, or the black character is a drug dealer, like those kind of things.
Right, exactly. And sometimes I think there's a little bit of overlap, but a distinction between stereotypes and tropes, like where a stereotype is like, this person with this particular aspect of their identity is like this because people with this aspect of their identity are usually like this or whatever. Right. But, a trope, I think usually is a little bit more of a narrative device. And, if you're just like trope, like, your story is just going to be very predictable, right? If you're just constantly, following, it's like, the third way trope. It's like, oh, but we have to do this or do this. It's like, but wait, we'll do this other thing. It's like, okay, that's cool, and a lot of times it's like the first time somebody does something, it's like, well, it's not really a trope yet. It's just a thing, right? It's an original idea. Like the twist ending, like someone had the first twist ending, right? And people are like, whoa, but then it's like, you get to a point, and if you're just like, okay, but what's there it is,
I mean, Casablanca is one of my favorite movies in the world, and it's always funny to me to watch it with people who don't really know it well, because I'll know a lot of people who are like, this movie is so cliche, it's so boring, and they're like, no, but this is where the cliches come from.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
That's not entirely true. Like, some of it was probably drawing on its own tropes, but it really, a lot of like movie tropes that were big for many, many decades come from that movie,
Right. And so I think the kind of, the problem is like, I mean, you can have problematic tropes that are just problematic in the first place, but more frequently, I think it's, you could call it lazy writing, but like sometimes it's just kind of uninspired. And if you don't have like real characters going through these different situations, if you just lean into every trope that's kind of presented, then things just become very predictable and kind of boring, I think.
Right.
And one thing that I would say that the Queen's Gambit does very well is it sets you up, as you said already, it sets you up for a bunch of tropes that then don't happen.
Yeah.
So that then when something does happen that seems predictable, it's not really predictable in the same way, because you feel like, or at least I felt like, oh, well, I feel like this is probably going to happen now, but they've already not gone in a particular direction, or not gone in the direction I expected so many times, that then when they do go in the direction that I would have first guessed, it's almost like a surprise because it's not a surprise, because the other things were a surprise.
Yeah, I think I'll use two examples of that. One is, and it's funny because I hadn't even thought of it till you mentioned it, one of the tropes that you really don't like, this show kind of uses. The mentor dying halfway through the story.
Right.
Beth's adopted mother, who, and even I mean, if you back up a second, because there's another trope here. The mother and Beth are very disconnected, in part because the husband has left and the mother is falling into drinking, and so Beth is really seeing the same pattern that happened with her birth mother happening, and is really getting concerned by it.
Yeah.
And then Beth wins a tournament and gets a lot of money because of it. And the mother's eyes kind of light up. And I remember I said to Paul, like, oh, okay, here we go. Now we're going to get the, like, dance mom, soccer mom trope. And we sort of do, but here's the thing is, it's not just the paint by numbers, like, the mother's terrible, the mother pushes her to play chess. Like, they have an actual complicated, nuanced relationship that falls broadly under, soccer mom, but is much more complicated than that, and that there are times when you don't have the scenes of of Beth thinking, maybe I don't want to play chess anymore, and the mom be like, no, you have to. Like, that's kind of what I think of the trope, and here it subverts that. But where I was really going with this is, that trope of like the men. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think more like stage mom than soccer mom, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think it's anytime a child has an incredible talent at something, and the parent is very invested in the child being good at it, sometimes to the point where it is more so than the child,
right?
And where there's a slippery slope of, is the parent doing it to help the child get their dreams, or because the parent is living out their own dreams, or because the parent wants to get money, or all that to me, it's stage mom, it's soccer mom, it's dance mom.
I just think of soccer mom as being something different, like sort of like suburb, like taking kids to their regular activities, as opposed to like star soccer player mom kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very, very a fitting distinction there. But yeah, so it subverts that trope. But then also when she dies, it is the trope of, you know, the mentor dies and now the hero doesn't really know what to do with themselves anymore. But part of what it reminds me of is that, I mean, tropes are based in reality, you know?
Right.
And the problem isn't that you shouldn't ever do that thing. It's that when you only do that thing, you're really limiting you're saying that, like, you know, sometimes when A happens, B happens. Mm-hmm. But if every story is if A then B, then now you make A very boring, you know? And right. This was kind of a like, yeah, we are going to say if A then B, but in a way that because so many other A's haven't led to B's, this one works.
Right, exactly. And I would say that it's like the mentor dies before hero like reaches potential or whatever, but like she's really not a mentor. She's like,
she knows nothing about chess. She's a guardian, really, but
yeah, exactly. She's a legal guardian and like a friend. You know, I think she really doesn't do a lot of like mothering, really. And but like she's a person. You know, she loves to play piano, but she never really did, or she used to be nervous in front of people, like, so she didn't really go into that. And, you know, she lost a child. We don't know the details of that, but we can see that there's a weight from that, right?
Right.
That her relationship, you know, it seems couldn't survive. And so it's like, this is a character with depth, even though she doesn't really say a lot of words. And so the whole, you know, the relationship works because it's somewhat complicated. It does trade in things that are kind of common and you expect to see, but then there's just some other things that are less common and you don't expect to see. So it feels real, and that's, you know, and so also the tropes. It's like, yeah, when then it's like, oh, you know, she's dead, and it's the scene that felt very much like when like Buffy's mom is dead, you know, like it's just she's there like with her eyes open. It's like, oh. And but
well, especially because there's two things there. One is that, as you said, the mother has played piano but never really been heard and never really gotten to do it. Mm-hmm. And so basically there's three scenes that happen. There's Beth comes down on her way to go play this major tournament against her old rival, and she finds her mother playing, and a whole bunch of people are like listening to her, and her mother's like finally getting this moment of actualization. Right. Yeah. And I said to Paul, she's about to die.
I was like,
because that's very much a trope.
LOL, but...
You know, that part's very much a trope.
Right.
And then, then Beth goes off and wins this great tournament, and comes home to find her mother dead. And I was like, oh, that's another trope, you know. And like, I'll be honest, that scene probably didn't hit for me as hard because I was a little like, oh, yep, there, she's gonna die now.
Right. I think she lost though.
Say again. Oh no, she lost. No, that's right. Yeah, so it's a double thing. It's
and like she's like complaining to her. She says, blah 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 blah. Mom, oh, you're dead.
Yeah, and so it winds up being a very powerful moment because it's, you know, she just had what she thinks is this terrible tragedy, and then she experiences an actual tragedy.
Right.
And I think that's an important moment for her. But yeah, it was kind of a tropey thing, and I think it's, you know, it can be good or bad. I want to back up also a second, because I think for some of those who are, you know, we've talked about this being a superpower, but some people may still be like, you're kind of off the pretty far out of bounds here in what you talk about. I think part of why we wanted to bring this topic up to begin with is that tropes come up in all kinds of media, but they are very prevalent in superhero media and science fiction and the kind of stuff that's a little bit more in the normal wheelhouse of what we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that actually made me feel that connection the most is kind of the training sequences and the process of acquiring and getting really good at whatever like the character's power is, essentially. And those are like my favorite scenes, and like the first Spider-Man movie, you know, where he's like trying to figure out how to use his webs, which, know, apparently come out of his wrists instead of web shooters. But like, you know, there's this like joy and this like kind of mystery of like, you know, what are my powers? Let me get better at them. Let me, you know, train, and like training sequences too, you know. I mean, we had one in the wonderful Batman vs Superman, but I just need to troll Matthew at least once an episode. But
how are you trolling me? I don't let you.
Oh, I was saying that it was a wonderful movie.
I don't think it's a wonderful movie.
That's the trolling part. Okay, I'll work on my trolling. But
That's fine. Zack Snyder has been trolled, which is something we've not done in a while, so we can check that box.
All right, cool. So, it's like that process of getting really good and like training. And that's a trope. Like the training sequence or training sequences is a trope. Like the, developing one's powers and then you kind of take them out and there's usually like a bunch of success for a while and eventually there's some challenges, some failures, followed by, questioning like, oh, I don't want to be Spider-Man anymore. Things are, the media is being mean to me as Jameson or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of the tropes that we see in this exist in superhero fiction. And I mean, superhero fiction is just like rife with tropes. Like my least favorite trope is like, no, my baby. It's like,
they show you they show you a cute white child as a way to give you the emotional weight of the terrible thing the bad guy's about to do.
Right. Or, I mean, more like I was being more specific. That's like a broader tropey thing. Like more specifically for me is like there's a burning building and there's like a woman outside who's like, no, my baby. And then the superhero has to go in and save the baby. It's like, how many times have we seen that? It's ridiculous.
We've seen that scene quite often.
Exactly. It's like, take your baby with you. Jeez. Like at least like if you're going to scream about it, be like, oh no, my cat. That's like a little bit better like spin on it. That's in the Justice League. But
for sure.
Where's Fluffy?
But I think it's part of why this is such a relevant conversation is, frankly, I find that a lot of how I view superhero media in terms of whether I like it or not, it is based on one of two things. Either A, does it subvert the tropes that we know, and especially does it avoid the more problematic ones?
Right.
And I'll certainly be very critical when I see a movie that I think does fall into the more problematic ones. And I'll just name, to me the best example is Ultron, in that a very common trope that I think is not just common but is really kind of problematic is to show that a woman is broken by showing that she can't get pregnant. And that just feeds into all kinds of like awful ideas of like what the nature of being a woman is and stuff like that. And so I don't love that about Ultron. But my larger point is like when I view media, especially superhero media, I'm thinking about, does it fall into the tropes and or does it subvert them? But if it does at least make the tropes, everything else around the tropes so good that I don't really care.
Right.
Like Guardians of the Galaxy is 100% trope. Like there is nothing about that movie that could not be predicted on some level. Like
I feel like the dance off at the end is is like an original idea.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the whole thing
it's
is
a distraction,
about,
like,
but goofy distractions, and I mean that like little details.
By
like
and large, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, did you ever, for any moment, have a thought that the bad guy was going to win that movie?
No.
Did you ever have any thought that these various criminals would not in some way redeem themselves by finding ways to do good things, and yet still have laughable interactions with the cops chasing them?
Right. Totally.
But the thing is that the movie was so funny and it made the characters so interesting that even though you knew yes, this person is broken in this way and so will do this thing, but the way that they're broken is so fascinating, the person who is rejected by society, been used for only one purpose, and thus has kind of turned grouchy and mean and angry at the whole world. That's very much a trope. Mm-hmm. But you make that person a talking raccoon. Well, okay, this is kind of a fun version of that trope.
Right.
So I think it's a thing to talk about when we look at this kind of media about, how are they using the tropes? Because, superhero by itself is a trope, as you said. You're not going to get away from it, but it really, I think, separates different movies and shows based on like how are they using it? Are they being thoughtful of the problematic aspects and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. That's one of the things I liked so much about like Ant-Man,
Mm-hmm.
and then Ant-Man and the Wasp. I mean, the first Ant-Man, like there's, you know, like Michael Douglas's character gets shot, right?
Right.
And Hank Pym, and it's like, oh, here we go. You know, the sort of mentor, older, wise scientist guy is gonna get killed, and it's like, don't worry, I'm not gonna die.
Yeah,
And
I
then
was
like
so happy about
he
that.
doesn't die. I was like, hey.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, they went, and it's like I think you can do this a lot with tropes and cliches and, you know, stereotypes or whatever. You can kind of like head towards it, and then if you like veer away at the right time, you can make that work for you.
Yeah.
Sometimes then that people do that so much that becomes its own thing.
Which is kind of like what we were saying from the beginning about how oh wait, we're not going to give you a happy ending. At first was like, oh cool, that's refreshing.
Right.
And then, oh, you also did that. Can we ever get a happy ending again?
Right. Like one time. Like, just mix it up. Like, honestly, the unhappy endings will feel more unhappy if there's, like, some happy ones. Yeah. Like, if we don't know, you know? It's like, if you're, you know, like, if you're watching a show like Game of Thrones, it's like, we get it. They're going to die. Everything's going to be horrible. Like, not my favorite show.
And one thing I think is interesting now is that there are definitely tropes associated with different production companies, you know, like if it's on HBO, I'm expecting a lot more nudity than the story necessarily needs. It's not always a bad thing, but it's just, and I'm expecting the violence to be of a very particular level of like gory bloodiness.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, because in many ways I feel like this show would not have felt as breaking of tropes if it had been on ABC.
Sure.
But there's a lot of things that happen on Netflix, especially. I mean, and like, you know, I'll say early in her childhood, after we already established that she's traumatized, and we get the sense that maybe more trauma is coming her way, she's introduced to two older male figures, both of whom have very sort of grouchy, like we're not sure what kind of relationship they're going to have with her.
Yeah.
I 100% expected at least one of them to be sexually inappropriate or abusive or suggestive or like something like that, because that is so common on Netflix right now.
Yeah, me too.
And it was so good when it didn't happen. You know, it was just like, oh no, he's just a grumpy old man, or he's going to be terrible to them, but some other way.
Right. Instead, eventually she has, you know, potentially questionable interactions with men closer to her age.
Right.
That, you know, but again, there, it's like, I feel like some of that's a little tropey, but some of it's a little not. Like with Towns, you know, I felt like that was one sort of an unexpected way of dealing with it, where he invites her to her to his hotel room and he's taking pictures of her, and it seems very much like he's hitting on her, which I think he is to an extent, but I think there's also a lot going on in terms of like both of the characters' motivations being kind of unclear, not just to the audience, but to themselves. I think neither of them really clearly know what they want. And then this other guy comes in who Towns is sharing the hotel room with, and I don't think it's clear what their relationship is, but there's some, I felt there was kind of some subtext there. And, you know, then at the end, like, she sees him again, like, you know, when she's in Moscow, and, like, he's clearly, like, wasn't sure. He was like, yeah, I was confused then. And so I you know, I feel like they didn't get too explicit, like, exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But it felt like he was, you know, probably gay or questioning at the time. And that, you know, it felt like not tropish, like it felt real to me, you know, just that it was like, you know, these are people who were kind of trying to figure out like what they wanted, and you know, they weren't quite sure, and then, you know, they kind of get interrupted, and then the moment's gone, and then, you know, nothing really happens.
And I will say, I do wish I misread that scene the first time I saw it, because what I wish that the movie had been a little bit clearer about exactly how old she is at different points.
Yes. I feel like it might have been deliberate, by the way.
I think that's very possible. And I think in some ways part of the story, a real part of the story is that she is, you know, basically like her maturities are being radically different in that, you know, she's in especially when she's a teenager, she's at a point in her life when she is intelligent enough and skilled enough to beat adults at a game of mental prowess without barely breaking a sweat.
Yeah.
And she's able to kind of exist in this world, but she's also in many ways very underdeveloped and very immature in some ways. And, again, like because her age is at that point very unclear, I wasn't sure if we're meeting like we're seeing like an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old, or if we're seeing a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old.
Right. Or even like a 23-year-old. Like, we're not sure how old he is, I don't think.
And I think like the age does matter, in terms of where she is in the maturity stage. But I think also you might be right that they intentionally don't really tell. They do establish later, I think, that they were much closer in age than it might have thought, and that like whatever happened wasn't really kind of that level of inappropriate. But I think part of what it's again, the trope would be you make him clearly the older, experienced guy who's going to take advantage of the young girl because she's whatever her actual age is. She's very immature. She's had very little social development, and he can, mwahaha, like take advantage of her in some terrible way. That would be the trope.
Yeah.
Instead, I feel like you get this whole world of people who are, because all the people she socializes with are not really even just chess players, but we're all kind of child prodigies in their own way. So you have all of these people who are in late teenage years, or sometimes maybe a few years over 20, all in like different stages of weird maturity, of being very mature in some ways and very immature in some ways. And there's a sexual encounter that is shown where she's with a stoned college guy that I think is very much supposed to be a like, this is not the greatest. This is pretty sketchy. This is someone taking kind of advantage of her. Although in a great scene that kind of establishes her feelings and intimacy, she kind of pats him on the back right after it's done, and it kind of like,
amazing.
Good try, buddy.
It's like, keep, there you go, sport. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
That's rough, buddy.
I forgot that.
Yeah, it was such a great moment. And I read, there's an interview with the actress about the way the different sex scenes are shown.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, with no nudity whatsoever.
Right.
Which again, like Netflix? Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, not so much like sex scenes. I mean, I guess they are sex scenes, but like some of them it's like after some of that. The one where she's like, oh, so that's what that's supposed to feel like.
Yeah, which is kind of a nice moment of her recognizing. Because again, I feel like it's again showing how detached she is from a lot of these things. That she's sort of like, oh, I think I'm supposed to feel horny now. Okay, well, let's see what this is like.
No, but also just I think that like her previous, encounters were not really up to.
Yeah. But that's what I mean is I feel like that's part of it because she wasn't into it to begin with even.
Oh, maybe.
But also, I think also like stoned 1960s college guy is maybe not the most invested in being the most attentive lover. I think it's a really good statement.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we were off on a long tangent that I have no idea where we started from. But yeah, in terms of talking about all this, I feel like it's another way in which it subverts some tropes in order to kind of make this larger point about how all the people in this world are in this kind of really crazy state of being very adult, with all the hormones of being teenagers, with all the lack of socialization that they've all had. And it winds up making it a very poignant story because of the way it plays with those tropes.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, I don't know if all of them are kind of on the same level in terms of like lack of socialization. Like, like I'd say like Beltic seems like very awkward, whereas, Benny seems like, he's like a pirate, he's like a chess pirate, basically. Like,
to me, Benny is the kind of like the best example of the big fish in a tiny pond,
Yeah,
he is the king of this chess world. He is the state champion who she defeats. The US champion. Right? Yeah. He's the US champion at like 18 or so. And you kind of get the sense of like you ask him to like, go hang out in a fraternity, he's going to be a social nightmare. But in this world, he's, because he's just very good at talking about chess and playing chess and people look up to him, like he can play that game very well.
Yeah, I mean, I again would push back on that a little bit, just in terms of I think that's a little bit of an assumption that people make about, I mean, chess players specifically, but like more broadly, people who do excel at sort of niche and like intellectual pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
I very much didn't get that sense from it. I mean, I got the sense that he wouldn't really have any interest in going to a party at a frat house. But he seems like actually a very social creature to me. And I know what you mean about kind of the big fish in the small pond,
Mm-hmm.
although it's not that small of a pond. I think.
I guess what I mean there is that it feels like his main way of socialization is about chess, and then he has real trouble kind of breaking out of that. And to me, the moment I think that really shows it is, when he is like, at first he seems very like standoffish with Beth, and that he's not going to want to go to. She flirts with him, and he's like, "No, we're not going there."
Yeah.
And then later, like they are intimate. They do go to bed together, and you literally see them like out of breath. She says like, that's what it's supposed to feel like, is clearly having like all this wonderful, like, happy post-coital serotonin-y, like emotional feelings. And he just immediately, like, while catching his breath and she's cuddling, starts talking to her about chess again.
Right.
And then seems to have like no understanding of why she's looking for a level of intimacy that he just seems utterly clueless about, which is interesting because the exact same thing had happened with her and a guy who she slept with beforehand.
Right. But the opposite.
Yeah, where she was on the other side of it.
Yeah.
But so I guess that's what I mean when that scene to me is where I was like, he doesn't really know when to stop talking chess and like have other kinds of human interactions.
Right. Sure. I mean, I feel like maybe that's partially just because of her being her.
Mm-hmm.
That's like how that's like what they've talked about, and I think that's what he finds most interesting about her. And I thought earlier on him kind of shutting her down when she was flirting with him it felt more almost like a principled kind of stand as opposed to like necessarily a lack of interest, but just kind of like, no, we're here for the chess. But I can see definitely. I think yours is a very valid interpretation, and possibly what was more intended.
Yeah. I think you can see it either way though, and again, it's because it's not fitting into a trope, which is where it's nice.
And I think both of them just have that same sort of level of obsession with the chess. I guess I almost saw it the opposite way, in that like for him it felt like that wasn't necessarily like an outlier of an encounter, whereas for her that was like the first time that it seemed like she was like really into it,
right?
Or like had a satisfying encounter.
I think for me, I mean, he's very much, when I said like the big fish, like he is very much the center of every social group that we see him in, and I think I kind of had the feeling that he's more used to groupies than equals, especially when it comes to lovers, and that maybe part like. He really is interested in her. I mean, she beats him is where this all starts. And then he is like, okay, well, you beat me. Now I have to train you.
Right.
And part of it felt like to me like I need to find a way to stay relevant while I'm kind of adjusting to this new understanding of myself. Mm-hmm. But also that like, oh, you beat me. You're the first person I've met who can do that. And I guess to me that was almost that, like, I think it's partially a principle thing, but it's also kind of, it feels like he needs to draw a wall of like, you're already better than me in chess. I need to not like make myself emotionally vulnerable to you as well.
Sure.
Because he's more comfortable sleeping with people where there is a power imbalance, and they look to him, and then he's like, next city there'll be another girl.
Right. Yeah, I think that seems like a fair assessment to me.
So I think there's one major trope that I wanted especially us to talk about, because it's one you and I really talk about a lot, and it is very common, especially in the superhero and related stories we talk about, which is the redemption arc. And I bring it up because you and I have been talking about it for this show. In recent media, I feel like the redemption arc story has become a very popular thing, and there's a lot of debate about, like, is it done well or is it not? And that there are times where people are very critical because the redemption doesn't feel earned. Like one of the tropes is they do terrible things, they do one good thing, and then it's all okay. Looking at you, Kylo Ren. But then I think, two of the stories you and I have talked about really loving are the story of Zuko I keep wanting to call him Danny Zuko.
I know.
Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender and Catra from She-Ra.
Yeah.
Where the redemption story feels very earned. And on some level, I think I went into this like watching her hurt people because she's dealing with her own trauma. Like, I mean, she hurts people in ways that I think I can be very sympathetic to the people she hurt.
Yeah.
But also really sympathetic to her. I mean, she's coming from a
Right.
real place of trauma, and like it doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And I don't think she's a malicious person in any way.
No.
But I was like, oh, okay, so we're gonna set up for some kind of like a redemption story. And when those other people came back into her life without like she cleans herself up, but she makes no attempt at really sort of like she kind of jokes about how she was a terrible person. Yeah, she doesn't really try to like fix anything or make anything better. She certainly doesn't reach out to them to let them know she's cleaned up. Right. They just all of a sudden are like, oh, hi, we're here to help support you. It felt weird to me because it didn't feel like it was fitting the redemption arc that I wanted. And then in talking with it, you pointed out that's not really a redemption arc. Say more about that. Like, how did you see that story in terms of the redemption trope that we so often talk about?
Right. So I think I said that I didn't really think of it as much as a redemption arc as some other word that I don't remember what it was. I wish. Do you remember what word I used? Because it was a great word.
I remember that I came up with a term that
what was it?
Well, because what I said is that in talking with you, you helped me see that it's not a story about her redemption. It's a story about her conquering her demons.
Yes, that's what it is. Like I feel like this story is like more of her. It's a story of self-actualization and a story of like her becoming kind of who she is capable of being and getting over her demons, with some help from her friend. But it's like also, I mean, in terms of like redemption, the reason I don't really think of it as a redemption arc is like, she does some bad things in relationships and says some mean things, right?
Yeah.
But like, she's not hunting the Avatar, she's not like trying to like destroy all the princesses and like kill her childhood best friend or whatever. Like, she has a couple bad breakups mostly. And then, and then she has, serious, alcoholism problem and I forget whether she's on the tranquilizers as much then, but like she's clearly, so she's clearly got, addiction problems that she has to overcome. And it's like in the process of that addiction, she does damage to other people or does harm to them. But it feels like the level of harm that she does is like modest, right?
I think that's very true.
So I would say, it doesn't quite like rise. I feel like she doesn't need to be redeemed. Mm-hmm. She just kind of needs to like get better and then be herself and be okay. And I think I found the the ending in that regard with all the friends and exes to be like it kind of came a little bit out of left field, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't find it implausible, just more kind of like improbable. And I think maybe there could have been a little more kind of in terms of like how did that situation actually arise, and she didn't. It feels to me less like she earned redemption and more like they like gave her forgiveness. Yeah. Like basically, and because I mean, if you look at them, two of them were friends from when she basically first started competing at chess, right? Mm-hmm. Who were kind of like, oh, you're gonna be in the open division, and they're like, oh wow, she's really good, and then immediately, they kind of were sort of like brotherly towards her, right?
Yeah, very much so.
And then there was this guy who clearly had deep feelings for her, Beltic, who really wanted to help her. He reached out to her when she was struggling and tried to help her, but she pushed him away. Right. But it's like, that doesn't mean he doesn't still want to help her, right? Yeah. And when she's better and when she's kind of able for him to help her, then he's there again. It's kind of like, to me, it feels almost like he kind of gave her some space because she pushed him away. But then when there was kind of an opening to be there again as her friend, he wanted to do that. And then, and then there's Benny, who like really, I think, just loves the chess, and I think he really wanted her to beat Borgov, right? And like, and so I think he was like there for the chess as much as anything. And so each of those characters' motivations make sense to me. Like the logistics of who got in touch with whom to all be in New York to be on this phone call and analyze the game and whatever. That's a little maybe fanciful.
Her two broken-hearted ex-boyfriends whose only real connection is that they both got their hearts broken by her reconnecting to help her is maybe, as like 19, 18-year-old boys, is maybe something I have a little trouble with. But, it's
right.
It's
chess.
It's certainly possible. And in a kind of feel-good story like this.
Yeah, and I think there may be more in their 20s. It's very unclear. But, I buy it. I just feel like, if you did an 8th episode, like it would show kind of how that came together and then, whatever. But I think the actual ending was, it's like, it feels kind of like a trope that's not a trope, like if, do you want to say more on this? Or
yeah, I actually think it is quite because just to give you to catch folks up again who don't remember what we're talking about there, one of the things that's established early on is that part of why the Russians are so very, very good at chess is that they work as a team and that they're always supporting each other and helping each other and going over moves with each other. And then American players are much more individualistic and don't do that as often. And it's certainly, when they do, she has very much always been this like set apart, I don't need that, I don't need you. She does it all in her mind. She doesn't need to play it with other people. And so part of what happens is at the very end, they all do kind of rally around her and, over the phone, they tell her all these ways that they basically do what the Russian team is doing with her over the phone in an incredibly expensive call from New York City to Moscow in the 1960s.
Because the game is adjourned and she has to consider all the possibilities of what his latest move could have been and basically all the lines of the game going forward.
Right. And
it's very hard for one person to do that. So in real life, people have a second who will, go over it with them, and they might have a team of people. Yeah. This is a way that it really works, but it's not the way she worked. It's not the way, apparently, at least in the story, Americans worked then, but that the Soviets very much did this extremely effectively.
And I do think that is, again, also very much a trope, but one that feels earned in this, of the individual who learns that she needs to get the help of others to succeed.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you were talking about the trope that is sort of there?
No, I was going to say, that's spot on. That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say more like the applause and then the game in the park.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that's very much there. But it's the happy trope,
Right.
The modern version of it would often be the player is super pissed at, losing to a girl, and he says something that kind of hurts her and mars her victory. But instead, like, everyone she beats is incredibly gracious. And she beats this older chess grandmaster who she'd, like, literally studied him as a girl. And she says that to him, and then he says, I just lost to the best player who's ever beaten me. And it's just, she's so emotionally touched by it. And there were just all of these, sweet moments that were just really nice,
And he literally stands up and applauds along with, like, the gallery.
Yeah.
Which seems like a little bit of, like, one of those sports movie, those kind of tropes where it's like, yeah, okay. But, like, that actually happened, I think, in the 1972 World Championship. Boris Spassky actually stood up and applauded Bobby Fischer's victory in Game 6. After he'd been defeated, and it's like this sort of level of sportsmanship that's a trope, but it's like if it very much feels earned to me in this story. When it does, I think it can be very powerful. When it's not, I think it tends to be more of a kind of eye-rolly thing.
Well, and here's I think where the whole concept of tropes, at least as I see it, really comes in, because the thing is, I didn't expect it. I thought it was possible. But I didn't, know going in. The way that, when the mother played piano, I knew she was about to die.
Right.
And I think this is to me, this is the biggest problem with tropes, is that, like I said, sometimes A leads to B. But when, in your movies, and in some ways, the fact that A can lead to B means that, why should any individual writer not be able to say that A, in their particular story, leads to B?
Right.
In some ways, it's kind of shitty to be like, well, but everyone else did it, so you have to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the way audiences work, I think that's the thing, is like, if I've just seen 9 versions of something, like seeing a 10th version, even if it is like based on a true story. I mean, it's funny, while we were talking about this, while we were watching the show, you sent me information about this American chess prodigy right now, who's like 10 years old, and he's won some major tournaments. And it's funny because if you, I'll post the link in the show notes. If you read his biography, like, you'd immediately be like, why has someone not made this movie already? And it's, if it was a fictional movie, it'd be the most eye-rolly trope thing in the world. Like, he's the child of Nigerians who were refugees from conflict there. He learned how to play chess, like, in the refugee camp. Like, his father is, it's an amazing story and very true and, like, incredibly inspirational. But it just feels like every trope has gotten pulled out.
Right.
And it's a reminder, these things are based in reality. You know, they come from reality. But I think it's a valid thing for us to say as part of criticism, like, you know, okay, but when you're telling us a fictional story, like, you should be aware of, like, what the last 9 stories that used the same situation did, you know? And that if you're doing the same thing, even if your version is, like, totally interesting, it's probably going to suffer somewhat.
Yeah, so I think it can go both ways, though, in that I think there are certain tropes that it's like, instead of, oh, you have to avoid them, I think there's often a period of time where it's almost like you have to follow them, because this is what the audience expects, and this is what the audience wants.
Yeah. I mean, there's something comforting to some extent about that, you know? And, like,
I mean, even sometimes when it's, you know, a negative occurrence, when it's, you know, sort of like misery porn, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's definitely a sort of, when people talk about movies or certain types of stories being formulaic, you know, they're often using that derisively, right? But the word formulaic, but it's, there's also an extent to which it's like, if you follow certain formulas while also giving something kind of new and original, like, people will eat it, right? Like, baking is formulaic. Yeah. Like, people come up with new things. There's tons of different things you can bake, but, like, if you take a particular recipe and follow it, and it was good one time, like, it'll probably be good another time.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a little bit of a danger, and it's like something you can trade on, but if you do it too much, then, you know, it's going to be boring.
And I think you're right that there is something to be said there about the expectations. You know, when I go to a rom-com, like, there are some times where I want to go see a movie about, you know, real life romantic situations in which, you know, things might work out, they might not, I don't know, because romantic relationships are complicated, and I want to see how it plays out.
Right.
But when I go see a rom-com, if they break up at the end of the rom-com, I'm going to be really pissed. Like, that's not what I paid $12 and bought some popcorn for, you know? Like, that's what I wanted to see.
But sometimes you get that, you know?
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times, like, you
but then you might not call it a rom-com. You might call it something a little different. I don't know.
I think a lot of times it's marketed like that, you know? Like, I think, you know,
right.
We've talked a lot about the Netflix MCU. I think one of the things that really made the Netflix MCU fairly different was that, you know, the MCU movies, we were all pretty sure that the good guy was going to win in the end.
Right.
That it might not be a perfect victory and that something terrible might happen as well, but we were pretty sure that the good guy was going to win. I don't think we had that assurance in a lot of the Netflix shows. And in some of them, the good guy won, but sort of, and in some way, like, you know, or like in Jessica Jones, where she had to, like, murder a person in order to win, and we think that's the right thing, but it's more like complicated. Like, I feel like Netflix was a great place to say, let's take the superhero tropes and play with them, and maybe not give you what you're expecting.
Right. For sure. And then you kind of get a different set of tropes, like there's an old wise black guy and he gets murdered in episode 11, and then in another series they're like, oh, we'll kill him off earlier. But that would be an example of a trope I was not fond of.
Yeah.
But they do not follow, like, the movie tropes quite the same way.
and we've made a couple references to it, but I want to just kind of like lampshade it and talk about it a little more. I do think that one of the times for me that tropes become most problematic is when they are playing on racial or gender or other kind of stereotypes like that, and it's
totally.
It's like you said, it's the black character who exists to die, or to be like that source of wisdom for someone else, or the, I was having a conversation about this recently about how, like, yes, like Asian American scientists definitely exist, and that's a real thing, and showing them, if you only have white people as the scientists in a movie, that's not good. But when there was a while when I was like, oh yeah, let's get more Asian Americans into movies. Well, Asian Americans are smart and they're good with science. And so now every Asian American who appears, or every Asian character who appears, is the scientist or the computer nerd or the geeky guy, and is almost never the romantic lead. Like, that's just as bad, Yeah.
And,
I
don't know if it's just as bad, but it's definitely also bad.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
like, that's a conversation that people can have. But
it might be like, yeah, like you said, it's like the first couple times it was a good thing, but now that it's become a new kind of bad.
Yeah.
And the same, like, part of why I love The Wire so much, to switch gears very much, but is that, yes, it shows a number of black characters in the kind of stereotypical tropish roles of being, drug dealers and murderers and people from, like, bad neighborhoods and the like. But even within that, it shows an incredible... They're not just like, gangster number one and gangster number two. They're all people who are incredibly well actualized and have motivations and have backstories and have feelings and have quirks and all this. And then there's also a whole number of black characters that all other, as politicians or as cops. And frankly, like, probably the one who's the most villainous is the politician, much more so than killers. In some ways. And so, like, to me, that's...
In some ways, I mean...
Yeah, he's not a flat-out killer, but he's...
The serial killer's kind of also pretty bad.
I mean, shit. Of course so. But yeah, I had to get that one in once.
Yeah. But also there are people in the drug trade who are not black. So it's like, it's a show that's got so many characters, and it's able to, put people in roles where you might see it as a stereotype, but then also people who look like them in roles that you wouldn't see as a stereotype, and then other people in the other roles that you might not see as a stereotype. So it's like, to me, it's kind of about volume and ratio, and like, if you have one Asian character in your story and they're the doctor, like, that's not great, But, like, if you have 6 Asian characters in your story and one of them's a doctor, it's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, that's fine.
Which is why I think part of the power of things like Black Panther, where, like, you have an entire world where, like, it's not the 2 black characters in a white world, is again such a good way of breaking those tropes.
Yeah, it's the 2 white characters, basically.
The Tolkien white guys.
That's a good one.
Come on,
I haven't heard that one.
Oh, okay.
I would not have given you that reaction if I didn't very briefly think that you had just come up with it by yourself on the spot.
No, it's been a meme that was around for quite a while, but I'm glad.
Yeah.
But yeah,
right, good one, Watson.
And to pull it back to Queen's Gambit, I think this is one area where Queen's Gambit is actually quite good. In that, again, the young woman who is playing, the character is very attractive and certainly enjoys being attractive. And at one point, like, they lampshade that, like, the press asks her, like, can you be so glamorous while being a trans person, which again is highlighting kind of the sexism she's going through. And she discovers her sexuality, in some ways understands the power of her sexuality, but she doesn't become a vamp. She doesn't fall into the stereotype of the, like, like there's one in very particular scene where she's playing against a much younger Russian player. I think at this point she's like 17, 18, and he's 13 or so, 14. And he's clearly a very good chess player. He at one point, like, she can't defeat him easily. They have to adjourn. It's a hard match. But she also realizes that he has very much a puppy dog, like, oh my God, girl pretty, I'm 13 kind of crush on her.
Right.
At which point she, like, the next day starts being, like, a little bit more flirtatious, but also a little bit more like, ugh, I don't even have time for you. She gets up and walks away from the table all the time. She very clearly, like, uses the fact that he's attracted to her to get in his head and beat him. And it's a complete, like, other people have played mind games with her up to this point. It's a completely legitimate move. But it's nice to see, like, yeah, she uses her attractiveness in that one setting, but they don't just make her into a vamp character. You know, like, she doesn't just become, therefore, like, the pretty chess player who wins because she, like, mesmerizes the girl with her prettiness, which is a story we've seen 100 times before.
Right, exactly. She uses it to her advantage in that one exact scene, but, like, aside from that, it doesn't seem like it's particularly a factor.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the fact that someone else had played mind games with her also makes it more like she's not doing anything wrong. You know, she's playing the game.
Right.
Like she's
yeah. I mean, it's gamesmanship that I think certainly I don't think it's unreasonable to frown on it. Yeah. You know, where it's like my personal feeling is kind of like just play the game. You know, but at the same time, it's like it's certainly not against the rules.
It's not against the rules, and she's not the I think
she's definitely not the only person doing it.
It's not the best sportsmanship, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like, and I think you were referring to when Benny is like, "Hey, let's play some blitz chess, for $5 a game," and he just crushes her at it the night before they're supposed to have a match, right?
Right.
And then
he gets her to play a kind of chess that she hasn't played much in order to just kind of make her question herself in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he takes her out of her element, and then when they do actually play, it doesn't go as well as maybe it would have.
So one trope that has been very well established is you and I saying we're not going to go very long and then blitzing through much longer amounts of time. So I want to try and break that trope, even though we're well over the time I thought we were going to go. But let me just kind of close with two questions. So the first one would be, is there anything else about this specific movie you wanted to... it's not a movie, it's a show. But
yeah.
I think you're right, but because it's a full, complete series, that's why it feels like a movie.
It feels like a movie. It feels like a long movie. Like when they made, like, Daredevil, like, oh, it's like a 13-hour movie. It's like, well, this feels like a 7-hour movie. Except it's a closed circuit, right? It's done, so... Right.
Yeah, because, like you said, it's not a story of... It is a story of her self-actualization, and she gets there by the end, But so, is there anything else more about it that you wanted to talk about, or kind of other moments you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, basically just that one thing that was very important to me and helped me enjoy the series as much as I did was just that the chess was really legit.
Yeah.
I think when making a series about someone who's great at a thing, I think it's incumbent upon the author to know a certain amount about the thing and or to have consultants. I mean, one reason The Wire was such an amazing show is because, the creator, right? David Simon, right?
I think so, yeah.
Was a journalist and was it worked in that area, right? Worked with cops and, with the sort of drug scene in Baltimore. And so it was very real that way. And then when they
consulted with a number of both cops and criminals from that world, like where we're consultants on the scripts, yeah.
Exactly. And then when they started expanding the universe to include like politics, to include, the schools, to include the docks, I think they actually added writers who had experience in those fields.
They did, yeah.
So that it would feel more real, so that they could actually give a reality to it. And so actually every chess position, every game, there's actually videos analyzing the game that's played at the end, which is based on a real game, but then they expanded upon it and they consulted. They had Garry Kasparov, one of the greatest chess players of all time, former world champion, and Bruce Pandolfini, who was actually the Ben Kingsley character in Searching for Bobby Fischer. And so just the fact that the chess was so legit, it was real, like they're talking about certain defenses or certain attacks, and they make sense, for that avoids it, like gives kind of a sort of a legitimacy to the thing that the show is based around, and then it like avoids taking, I mean, that's just important to me in the first place for anything, but it also avoids people who have knowledge of the subject from like kind of getting removed from it, right?
Yeah. And I'll give another example of that because I agree with why it's so important, and then say something else about it. For me, the one that I always think of when I think of that is the movie Coco, the Pixar movie, which you still have not seen, right?
No, I've seen it.
Okay, so yeah, then you'll probably
I saw it in English and Spanish.
You maybe even think this even more than I do. Like, it is a movie about family. It's a movie about spirituality. It's a movie about redemption. It's a movie about so many beautiful things. And it's not really about guitar playing as much as like guitar playing is like a major sort of plot hook.
Yeah.
But it is the only movie I've ever seen, either live action or animated, where what the actual fingers on the frets of the guitar are doing matches the notes that are being played.
Right, right.
And to me, it's that same thing. Like, that, for me, as a guitar player, means so much. And what I'll say about what I think makes this show so good is, you're right, you know far more about chess than I do. You can look at a chessboard and analyze it in a way I really can't. And so, for me, it doesn't matter that the chess moves are accurate or not, because I couldn't follow them at the speed they were going.
But if you saw a pawn on, like, the first rank or something, you'd be like, that's not a thing.
Right, sure. But I mean, but what I was going to say is the opposite, is that a lot of times when something does what you're doing it goes to the technical level that makes the experts happy, it leaves the amateurs behind. And here they managed to not do that. Someone like me, who has much less chess analysis skill than you do, was still able to really feel invested and involved, and like, oh, okay, they're signaling with the music and with the lighting and with all sorts of other production things. They're telling me what's happening in the chess match right now without ever having to say it.
Right.
And to me, that, just as a production value, that's a really hard thing to do that the show was brilliant at. Like, being able to make both of us very happy with the chess scenes, I think is a real achievement.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, there's also, Anya Taylor-Joy, the actress who plays, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, but who plays Beth, is also in the New Mutants, if we need to, like, work in a little more superhero stuff.
There you go.
But, you look at her face and you're like, oh, she's losing this game.
Yeah.
You know, like, the very rare occasions where the character's losing a game, like, you can tell. And not because, like, of this, like, super, like, kind of, like, overdone, but just, like, you can see it, in her face. And they, they also communicate it with, like, musical cues and the way, the angles they choose and stuff like that.
I mean, I'll be amazed if that actress isn't nominated for an Emmy. Like, she was.
Oh, for
the person who played Beth, because I thought her fate, playing the kind of character she does, who has been through a trauma that causes her not to, like, lash out, but to turn inward. I mean, that's a hard thing to convey. And I think there's so many moments of emotional subtlety of where, like, you see her emotions starting to break through, but then she reins it back very quickly. Mm-hmm. Like, that's really hard to convey, and I've seen a lot of people do it very badly. So I was very impressed by her as an actress in that regard.
Yeah, I'd say it's a brilliant, understated performance. Yeah, is kind of how I would.
And I think that's the last thing I would say about the show, is that it was for me also very, very relatable in a lot of ways. Both for someone who had a mother who had some substance abuse problems herself, and some of the own stuff that I went through in my childhood. Like, it was without ever having to name a psychological diagnosis. And I think we don't, I think you could read her as being somewhere on an autism spectrum. I think you could read her as dealing with PTSD. I think you could read her as having a number of different psychological conditions. Yeah. Without any one being provable. I don't think it'd be right to say, like, she has this or she has that.
Sure, yeah.
But she clearly has, like, reactions that I think a lot of people who have been through trauma or can understand it can be like, yeah, that there's no point in which anything her character does doesn't feel real. Whether it's self-destructive or whether it's pulling herself out. And you're right. I think that here also it helps that it's not the super tropey, like, in the story where everything always goes wrong and everything is always terrible and the person, like, self-destructs everything. Mm-hmm. There was a review I read that said, this didn't really feel like a self-destruction story because the stakes are never that high for her. And it's like, well, but that's a lot more real. I think I actually said to you, like, she never hits rock bottom. And you're like, not everyone does. Some people get kind of low and then that's okay. And I really liked that,
Yeah. Yeah, me too. I mean, I really do feel like, this was her story. She has two moms who both hit rock bottom and die, right? One who very deliberately kills herself and the other who I'd say inadvertently kills herself. But she's not either of her moms,
And I was going to say, like, that other mom, like, at one point says very clearly, like, yes, I know the drinking and the smoking is damaging my health, but they're what make life livable.
Right,
so
exactly.
It's kind of a slow motion subconscious suicide.
Right, and so, but, like, as much as those, as much as they can have an influence on her, like it's not like you just always end up like your parents, right? And I mean, different people have different experiences, and having, showing something where someone hits rock bottom is completely valid. That's a real thing that happens in real life. Yeah. We have tons of stories like those. I found it very refreshing to have a story where someone struggled with trauma, struggled with addiction, and then just, didn't have that trope of like, hitting rock bottom, which is a real thing. Yeah. And it's not that you can't make stories like that, but not every story about addiction, not every story about someone dealing with trauma has to play into that. It doesn't have to follow that same script. And it was nice to see something that was just, different in that regard.
And it's funny, actually, because I also realized one more trope that this breaks that I think, maybe you disagree, but I know I certainly missed this one because I'm a guy, which is most of the time, if you have a movie about a woman who has trouble living up to her full potential, and along the way she pushes potential like romantic partners away. Yeah. It would be that the person that comes back into her life who saves her and who tells her it's all okay is the former romantic partner she pushed away. Right. And the fact that in this one, the person who really pulls her back up out of the black pit she's gotten into is her former best friend from childhood, where there's no romantic thing whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And then is the guy who, like, and then other parts of it
basically her sister.
Yeah, her sister basically does it. And then there's a guy who she had a crush on, but they really are much better as friends. And like, I mean, there's never that moment where like she gets that perfect kiss and it makes everything okay. And frankly, that is a really common trope as well. And this also subverts that. And that's also really, really nice.
Yeah. And it's like, from the point at the end where she decides to just go play chess in the park, like she might have some happy relationships after that. She might not. We don't know, but like that's not what the story was about. And so that didn't, they didn't use that to like bring her back around, essentially. Like she didn't like get redemption through the love of a good man or something,
Yeah, exactly. Redemption, or she didn't like him loving her and him seeing the good in her. It allows her to see the good in herself, or all those kind of things that we've just seen. Like, and again, like that can happen, but again, it's just it is such a sexist trope and one that's told so often.
Instead they fridge the groundskeeper and then the custodian.
It's definitely like it is his funeral that is like the motivating factor for everything.
Yeah, that kind of turns it around.
But. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's let me start that again. So yeah, that kind of wraps up the show. But in terms of the tropes themselves, because we were kind of melding two things here together that I think fit well, but are kind of two different tracks. Is there any more stuff about tropes themselves, or about any other particular tropes that you wanted to talk about being either good or bad?
To me, tropes are just like, there should be more stories. There should be more people writing stories, different people writing stories, and different people writing different stories, And I think as a result, you can have a bunch of stories that do one thing, and then you can have a bunch of other stories that don't do that thing. And, I would like to just see a wider variety of fiction in all dimensions, basically. And so when it comes to tropes, it's like, if you're writing a story, like be aware if something you're doing is like really leaning into a trope. Be aware if that's like a damaging trope or if it's just kind of like sort of cliche feeling. But like that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means be aware of what's going on with that, and don't always do everything that way. And this is a podcast, not like a writing class, right? But like, the point just being, it's like variety's good, and having some twists on something that's familiar sometimes can make it fresh. And if you have some things that don't go the way that we would really expect them to, then you can have other things go the way that we do expect them to, and that's not going to feel just like super like generic and boring and like eye-rolly kind of, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I think you actually, and you also touched on something that is really super important to this whole conversation that we really both missed up until this point, which is that a big part of where tropes come from is who's writing them, and that if you are, especially the problematic ones we're talking about, and that if it's if it's white, when white guys are writing, like, and I'm a white guy, say this is myself, like, you know, you're much more likely to write about a person of color or a woman in terms of how they relate to the people you know, and it's not universal by any means, but it's, you know, when you have more women writing, you're going to get more nuanced stories about women. When you have more people of color writing, you know, when you have more gay people, like whatever it is. I haven't even touched on how I myself as a disabled person, probably the trope I hate the most is the disabled person who gets a superpower that basically like fixes their disability.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it's why I really love like the few stories we get where like, Toph to me in Avatar: The Last Airbender is such a good example where she is able to be a superhero for all intents and purposes, even though she's blind, but she is still blind. You know, whereas like Daredevil is basically not blind. You know, like he has to like have someone read something to him. But other than that, but yeah, I think that to me is maybe even the biggest takeaway about tropes is like when more people are writing things, we're going to get less tropes. You know, when more different kind of people are writing things.
Right, or we're going to get a wider variety of tropes that kind of balance each other out a lot of the time, I think. Yeah,
for sure. For sure. Well, cool. I think this was a great discussion. I'm really glad you brought this to me. Folks, if you have not seen Queen's Gambit, I hope we have not totally ruined it for you. Because I still think, like we said, like a lot of the best storytelling, even if you think it's a trope, even if you know what's going to happen, is the way it gets from A to B. And I really think this is a wonderful, wonderful show that is very worth watching. And frankly, my partner's now gotten into it, and I'm going to watch it again, and I certainly don't think it's going to suffer from having seen it before. So thank you, Paul, for being a part of this conversation. For everyone else, what did you think of the show? What do you think about tropes? What are some of your favorite tropes or least favorite tropes? Write in, let us know. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter. You can email us. All the information can be found by going to strandedpanda.com and then going to the superhero ethics page on there, or just going to superheroethics.com. That'll take you to the same place. I want to do a quick plug. My other podcast, the Star Wars Universe podcast, we're getting super excited because Friday, October 30th, the day after this episode goes up, Mandalorian Season 2 is coming back. And we are really excited. We're going to be doing, every week, we're going to kind of do a double header. The new episode of Mando will come out on Friday. Friday night at 7:30 p.m. Central Time, 8:30 Eastern. We'll be doing a live online watch party where you can sign on and watch along with us at the exact same time and be in a chat room. Paul's going to try and be a part of that sometimes. Jeff Randall and Ashley Coffin are going to try and be a part of that. A couple other great people who are on the Star Wars or other superhero ethics podcasts or other Stranded Panda podcasts. And then often that Friday night, or at least by Sunday, we're going to also always record a podcast episode where we talk about that episode of Mandalorian, talk about what happened, talk about what we loved, maybe what we didn't like, how it fits into the story. And just yesterday, Paul and I, along with Ashley Coffin, did an episode where we kind of looked back on Season 1 of Mandalorian and talked about all the things we're excited for about Season 2, different theories, different ideas, you know, what's happening with the Blacksaber, what's happening with the Mandalorians and the Creed, and where does Baby Yoda come from, how much we really, really don't want him to be Yoda's grandson, you know, all that kind of stuff. So check that all out. It's all on it is all on the Star Wars Universe podcast page, also on strandedpanda.com, and you can also find that on Facebook, on Twitter, all those places. So on behalf of myself, Paul, everybody involved with this, thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.